question and your reaction. This meeting is being recorded, y'all. And, you know, it's okay if you have questions and don't know how to ask them. We recognize though this session was planned prior to COVID, prior to the civil unrest we're now experiencing around racial injustice, we feel that this is more important now than ever to have this conversation, and that we recognize that folks are actively seeking to develop their skills. So please take a moment to review the community guidelines. I did paste them in the Zoom group chat, as well as the Google Doc link, which has some like critical definitions, and it also has our speaker bios as well, so you can take a look at those. And I am going to pass it back to Chloe now to kick things off.
Thank you so much, Jess. So just to give you all a little bit of background on who we are and why we're here, the Nursology Theory Collective, we're a group of students and scholars from all around the globe that formed at the landmark conference, Nursing Theory, a 50-year perspective, past and future, that was held on March 21st, 22nd, and 2019 at Case Western Reserve University. Unfortunately, we did not get together this year, but we've still been actively working, and this is one of the topics that we're really passionate about. And our mission at the Nursology Theory Collective is to advance the discipline of nursing and nursology through equitable and rigorous knowledge development, using innovative nursing theory in all settings of practice, education, research, and policy. Our focus as a collective is to make nursing theory accessible, practical, and fun, help nurses believe that they all have a voice and themselves are theorists, dismantle systemic norms about nursing and nurses, use our knowledge, privilege, and power to move nursing forward with policy, and empower the practice and the science of nursing. So today with us, we have Dr. Lucinda Canty, who is a nurse midwife researching outcome disparities in maternal morbidity and mortality. She recently graduated with her PhD from the University of Connecticut, and she teaches at the University of St. Joseph. Dr. Canty is also an artist, and you can see some of her work that she's done previously in the link provided. Dr. Canty is an advocate for all women to have a safe and supportive pregnancy. She also recommends the use of doulas. Lucinda, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming.
And we have Patrick McMurray, who is he is a second generation nurse, and he works clinically as an adult float pool nurse. He also teaches nursing pharmacology as an adjunct nurse faculty, and he's passionate about community colleges and the access to education that they furnish. Currently, he's working on his Master's of Science in Nursing Education at Western Governors University. And just as Jess had said, Patrick, would you like to say hello to everybody?
Hey, everybody.
So happy to have him here too. As Jess had said in the chat box, if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box. We have enabled it so that the questions that you ask, we will review them, and when we get to the end of the session, we will, pending time, discuss what we have available to discuss. So, definitions, just to give a brief introduction here, we're talking about diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion. And what's important when we're talking about diversity is we recognize diversity as a broad range of individual, population, and social characteristics, including but are not limited to age, sex, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, family structures, geographical locations, national origin, immigrants and refugees, language, physical functioning and learning abilities, religious beliefs, and socioeconomic status. And that's by the 2017 AACN position statement on diversity, inclusion, and equity in academic nursing. We're going to be talking about the other definitions a little bit more in depth with our panelists. But to begin, we're going to acknowledge the lack of diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion in nursing. With everything that's going on in the world, it's time that nursing takes a look at itself as a whole. And look, being a safe space, we expect everyone to be respectful in this setting to enable learning and growth so we can move forward together through co-creation. So that takes us to our first question of this webinar. And we'll start with Dr. Canty. And so Dr. Canty, what we're going to ask you and Patrick today is, why is it important to understand diversity? And then why is it important to sit in the discomfort of it?
So a lot, since we planned and decided to do this event, a lot has happened in our world. You know, COVID-19 pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, the continued violence against Black and brown people in this country. And we're like, now because of cell phones, we're seeing these injustices. So for me, who identifies as a Black woman, African-American, I'm also the mother of a 10-year-old son. So I'm not the same person I was when we started to initially plan this than I am now. So I'm still feel myself going through a grieving process. But one thing is I can say is that I love nursing. Nursing has been my life since became my first job, 27 years, still in nursing. So I know that nursing can do something to address these issues. Like nursing is right at the center of it. And there's no way for us to separate ourselves from what's happening in the world. You know, we could pretend like racism doesn't exist in nursing education. It doesn't exist in healthcare. We can't do that. So one way to address the issue is we do need diversity. We have to be at the forefront of making a change. And I feel like nursing has a capacity to increase understanding, develop solutions, and just improve healthcare and improve health outcomes. You know, I just feel like we can do it at all levels. But unfortunately, diversity does not exist at all levels of nursing, from that associate degree nurse all the way up to that nurse with her DNP or her PhD. And I do recognize that diversity is not easy to talk about for anyone, because we have to talk about racism. We have to talk about white supremacy. We have to talk about oppression. And we have to talk about how this has existed in our nursing history. It is not easy for anyone. It's not easy for me as an African-American woman. You know, especially when you experience racism yourself in a profession that you love, those wounds run deep and it's not easy to talk about. But I feel that it's important for us to have these conversations. And I think that discomfort hopefully is just something initially that we can overcome, but we have to have these conversations. Okay, and diversity, just one last thing, and diversity is not just about putting a few people, hiring a few people, you know, working with a few people of color. It also involves, for me, having an environment where I feel safe, where I'm seen, where I'm heard, where I'm recognized as a valuable member of the team. It's just so important that people recognize my contributions, you know, whether it's in an academic setting or it's in a healthcare setting. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Canty. That was wonderful. Patrick, would you like to take it from here?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Canty. It's kind of hard to follow up behind that, but those are really good comments, and I kind of echo a lot of those emotions and a lot of those feelings. Diversity is important because nursing in itself is an act of justice. And that's something that I've only recently kind of got to learn, that by me being a nurse and my act of nursing someone, it's an act of justice. I can help for a moment correct the wrongs in a world that is just constantly doling out those wrongs. And diversity is important because we want to make sure that the nursing or the justice that we're administering is not restricted to a person that looks a certain way, or a person that speaks a certain language, or a person that can walk on two legs or can't. You know, we want to make sure that the justice that we're administering is available to all people, not just people that we're comfortable with or people that we are used to dealing with. And so it kind of comes with that discomfort when we start asking questions like, can a person that's in a wheelchair be a nurse? Can someone who speaks English poorly be a nurse? You know, and confronting
Yes.
terms like those things we think like, no, you have to speak English perfectly. You have to be able to stand and lift patients. We have to confront those things. And so they aren't comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And how can we get to the point that we're going to move past it? It means that we have to lean into the discomfort, because a lot of those of us who have felt the lack of diversity have been uncomfortable our whole lives. We were born into discomfort. Someone who was born not able to walk was born into discomfort, and they have to navigate that every day of their life. And so the least we can do is join them and sit with them through the discomfort to learn how we can make a world and that they are valued and that they have equal opportunity.
That was beautiful, and I just want to highlight that nursing is an act of justice. And thank you, both of you, for sharing your thoughts on diversity and highlighted how it's important to be uncomfortable in it to grow. I also want to highlight that with diversity at the starting place, as Dr. Canty had suggested, and with that, we have to look deeper into other issues like oppression and racism and everything that falls underneath that. It's not an ending point just to say we're diverse, it's the beginning. So with that, we're going to move on to our next question, moving into the idea of equity versus equality, which are often topics that are confusing to many people, even nurses, when we use those terms a lot. So my question, I'm going to start with Pat, is why is it important for nurses to understand the difference between equality and equity?
The importance kind of lies in looking at where we are in time. Equality tells us that we all deserve the same things equally, and that's all and good, but when the starting point hasn't been equal, it kind of creates a discord. So that's where equity kind of comes in. And with equity, it kind of acknowledges that people may be starting at a different point than others. And one of the best ways I've seen this illustrated is you might have seen a video on social media where this coach has everyone line up on a line and they're doing a race and he's offering them $100. And he says, okay, but before that, I'm going to make a few statements. And if those statements apply to you, take a step forward and, towards him with the money. And so he makes statements like, did you grow up in a household with both of your parents? Did you grow up in a household where, did you grow up in a household where you had access to the internet always? Things like that. And then you started seeing this staggering effect of people who had these different advantages. And then at the end of it, you saw a lot of the people who were left behind were almost explicitly people of color, and that they were at a significant advantage. Now, the start time for the race was going to be the same for everybody, so it was equal in the start time, but their starting place wouldn't be equal. And so that when it comes to equity, it means that sometimes we may have to give a little bit more to someone else because they started off with less. That's kind of a good way to illustrate it. I think of standardized testing, which is something, standardized entrance tests for nursing school, for graduate school, a lot of those things. The world's kind of realizing that they're not the best predictors, for success, long-term success, but not only that there are barriers and that they're not necessarily, even though they're standardized and they're equal, they give everybody an equal chance. The thing is, a lot of people are starting behind the line. When everyone's not starting at the same line, it's impossible to say that something is equal. So equity means that versus where I'm requiring you to take this exam and I graduated at a school where I had, there's 30 to 40 students per teacher versus someone who went to a school where there are 15 to 20 students per teacher. And how the quality of the school may impact their scores, their socioeconomic status. Did they have internet at home? Are they first generation? Did they have parents who could speak English at home? So these students who are likely just as capable, but they're starting farther back because they didn't have the same resources as someone else. Mm-hmm. So more equity would be like, okay, well, instead of we're going to wait and we're going to put them through a program that allows them to gain the knowledge and get the support they need so that when we start, it's more equitable. And that's kind of an example of why equality itself is not enough. It's not enough just to say we want to all be equal. And there's an example of the boxes, you see that, but it's kind of a very limited example, which is why I didn't refer to it. But equality is the starting point, but it's certainly not applicable in every situation, and it doesn't take into account all circumstances and all situations that need to be considered when you're talking about making a more just and equitable world.
Yes, and I agree with you, Patrick. I think that, and I I look at it in the lens of that nurse caring for that patient too. It's like, we don't know a lot of times where people are coming from. And sometimes we make assumptions based on maybe correct information, maybe not, but it can have a significant impact on the patients that we serve. So I feel like it's so important for us to get to know and ask those questions and find out where our patients are coming from. It's like telling someone when COVID-19 started, go home and isolate yourself. But if you're living in a house where there's 15 people, how do you isolate yourself? You know, wear a mask, get hand sanitizer. But what if I don't have access to those resources? And I like that there were a lot of public health interventions that provided this. And I just want to say, like, when we're looking at equality, when we're looking at equity, a lot of times we, like what Patrick said, everyone's not coming from the same place. And there are structures that prevent people from getting to that place where we want them to be. So we're more likely to blame them when we don't look behind the scenes to say, what is it that they need so that I can make sure that they're healthy? So there, again, there's structures that are beyond what they can do if they're living in poverty, if they're living in an area where the hospital, closest hospital is 2 hours away. You know, we have to look at those pieces. And those are things a lot of times that they can't control. So how do we as nursing, how do we address that?
Thank you both for your responses. And once again, I think you both hit the nail on the head in addressing the importance that equality is not enough, and we need to look how we can promote equity in nursing for ourselves, as well as for our patients and for our discipline, and start having those uncomfortable conversations that maybe potentially people are avoiding, and acknowledging that not everyone comes from the same background, whether they're your colleague, your student, or your patient. So thank you both for those responses. And I'm going to turn the next question over to Jeff now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
One of the things too that that's sort of a theme that I heard from both of you is that, like, equality is of opportunity usually, and then equity, I think, focuses more on outcomes. And Lucinda, you kind of wrapped it up in this beautiful bow, right? Like, people will talk about it's not nursing's lane, right? To think about whatever, pick your topic that we're not supposed to have an opinion about. But I think that when you think about those kinds of structural considerations, well, suddenly, like, how can we pretend like we're advocating for health if we know our communities don't have clean water or safe parks to play at, right? Like, that's just, so welcome to our big lane highway, right? So our
can I just add one last thing?
Sure.
No, I was just going to say, you know, and this is probably a look at myself to some degree as a white nurse. You know, we're taught from a very young age not to talk about racism and, you know, about colorblindness and inequalities that other people face that are not in, you know, ethnocentric whiteness and that perspective. And I think it's time we need to look at that whiteness that, you know, may affect some of us in nursing, and how that affects what questions we're asking to our patients.
I agree.
Yes.
So the next question is I think it's relevant to some of the comments that are starting to come in, and it is, how does nursing's lack of diversity, its normative whiteness, its compulsory heterosexuality, elitism, colonialism, how does this impact our nursing knowledge and specifically our theoretical thinking, and where does it come from?
Well, I want to start with the lack of diversity, because a lot of people think that's something new, but when nursing was like in the 1850s, when nursing to establish like a formal nursing education, these formal programs or schools of nursing, it really started there, about who had the potential to be educated as a nurse. And I'm going to go back in history just very briefly and want to show you, this is a book that you guys are probably familiar with, Black Women in White. And this is by historian Darlene Clark-Heim, where she talks about kind of like how Black women struggled in the nursing kind of profession, their experience, and how racism was a big part of that. But since arriving, you know, on slave ships, Black women assumed the role of being that healthcare provider, providing nursing functions. They delivered, you know, we know they were midwives. They provided care to the sick, and during those early wars, the wounded. And they went beyond, you know, just focusing on the physical aspects. because this is, I think, some of our early kind of public health providers. So I know I'm going a little bit back, and I'm not going to go deep into the history, but just kind of to let you see where these things are, these beliefs or these kind of structural things started. And again, though Black women had this history, they didn't have access to nursing education. They didn't have access to nursing organizations. So they end up finding their own, kind of that separate, but definitely not equal institutions where there were hospitals that were for Black Americans, and that there were nursing programs. And even now, way back, this is 1910 to 1920, only 3% of the trained nurses were Black. And now I think that we're about up. I have to look at the statistics again. I keep seeing different numbers. I've seen like 10, I've seen like less than that. So we haven't really, this is 2020, we haven't really made that much progress. But anyways, those structures kind of started then with, you don't have the ability to be educated to become a nurse, or there's a certain, again, even within the Black population, you had to come from a certain socioeconomic status to be educated. And a lot of programs limited, they would take one, or we know in the South, they were segregated, they didn't take any. So I just feel like those barriers that prevented Black women from being educated then are still present now for people of color. Getting admissions to nursing programs, getting that support in the classroom and in clinical. And when we're looking at the development of nursing knowledge, we know that we want our nursing scholars, we want our PhD prepared nurses, but what are those barriers that people experience as they're trying to get that degree? And once they do get their PhD, are they invited in on research teams? Is their research being funded? Are they getting NIH grants? Is their research being even used once they go through and do these studies that are finding very valuable information? Are they being used? It's like, who determines, who is authority in nursing? Who determines who makes decisions about what we want our students to learn, what we want to be as far as patient care? Who develops that reality? And sometimes it's not based on my experience. And I'm just thinking of, because I use nursing research to help guide my teaching. I use it to help in clinical setting. I use it to help me address problems, help me look again beyond those physical pieces. But sometimes I wonder, are they thinking about me when this is being developed? Like, who are they thinking about? And does it apply to the person that I'm caring for in front of me that may not fit, who deserves to even receive health care? So I just wonder, again, these longstanding beliefs that are part of our nursing history, unfortunately. And again, and they're so embedded that I think that we don't even realize it. And I think it's something that we all unconsciously participate in. And I just think that this is a time where we're saying we have to look a little deeper. We're looking at health disparities, because for a lot of people, having some of these beliefs puts them in a life or death situation. They're coming to you for care. And if you don't know how to address and put all these pieces together, if you don't even look at them as being human, how are you going to provide the care that they need? And the person on the other side of that, they don't even realize how much danger they're in a healthcare system that they're supposed to feel safe and trusted, and trust their providers.
Thank you, Lucinda.
That was great.
Yeah. Awesome.
For me, I feel like it could be said that this problem has an innumerable amount of origins, but what it kind of filters down to at the core of it is elitism. And elitism is kind of the mother of racism, the mother of classism. It's the kind of overbranching thought of always needing to kind of establish superiority over another one, imperialism, things like that. Even misogyny, and what has always baffled me about nursing is that misogyny exists within the profession, despite it being a very overwhelmingly female, or a female, or those who identify as female, population, and misogyny runs strong, and patriarchy impacted heavily, and stemming from all of those things become things like innocent ignorance or implicit bias, and complicity, and simple apathy as well. We tend to acknowledge the need for diversity on an external standpoint a lot in nursing, but not really on an internal standpoint within our own profession. And we have a lot of work to do. I think that something that we have to remember is that I really want to speak to the elitism that I personally have experienced and witnessed, and that I have to keep in check myself in nursing, particularly with my step stool, which is that of being a community college educated nurse. Some people, I shared this story yesterday in the story circle with the radical nurses, but I was someone that is a second generation nurse. I had a mom that was a nurse. I attended the same community college she did. I had every opportunity to go to a university, but I decided not to. So at 17, I graduated from high school, finished 1 or 2 prerequisites, and 18, I started nursing school at a community college. And the overwhelming thing with my family, they were like, "Why are you wasting your energy at a community college? You can do so much more." Even my family members who started at community colleges themselves, they thought I was limiting myself. And so I go in at 18 and I finish at 20 years old, and I enter the workforce, and I'm like, I'm excited. I've gotten this great education. My school has this awesome reputation of putting out capable nurses. And the first thing I hear in my orientation is that, well, that's a nice start, but you need to start thinking about the future and what you need to go to next. And what I want to highlight is, because in my actions on Twitter, I've always had to clarify, I've always had the goal when I started my associate's degree. I knew I was going to go on to get a graduate degree. I knew that from early on. And in my example, and an example of a lot of different nurses, like Chloe, like Dr. Anna Valdez, I know all of these people who started off at an associate's degree, who have accomplished great things or are accomplishing great things, that are getting their PhD, that became advanced practice nurses. And so what it shows is that there's really not the only limitations are the ones that nursing puts up itself, or the ones that we allow ourselves to accept. And so, but the thing that we find, that we're finding, is that a lot of people advocate for the BSN, and I'm an advocate because I know I benefit from the BSN myself. And I'm have to make it clear, I'm not an anti-BSN person. I'm all for nurses academically progressing and empowering them to do that. But the concern is, and this is a big part of my platform and why I do what I do, is that when we start talking about things like we need to eliminate and abolish all of the ADN programs, or just, we need to get to a BSN entry now, what we're doing is we're leaving out a lot of people. And as much as we talk about oppression and being open and having empathy, nursing sometimes has a really hard problem with doing that internally for its own practitioners. And that's something that we have to go through. Nursing, the way that we promote academic progression has been very toxic and very degrading to our colleagues who are LPNs, who started off at an ADN, or anything like that. And if you look at this dynamic here, we have ADN programs, we have LPN programs. Most diploma programs have faded out. We have one left in North Carolina, and it just transitioned to being a bachelor's program. But you look at those entry points, and then, in the past few years, we've seen a lot of entry points make it possible for people who already have a level of privilege to be able to transition into nursing. So we've seen the creation of master's direct entry programs, of accelerated BSN programs. And those programs of themselves are not bad, but we've made this welcoming environment for people who already have privilege to be able to join the profession. But when it comes to those, the way that we allow people who look like me, and the fact that for a lot of people who look like me or who come from a background like me, you're poor, rural, Southern, something of that nature, minority, we've not always been the most welcoming, and saying that I realized that this ADN programs, associate degree programs, the LPN pathway, that's the only way these people can get from point A to point B. And so a lot of my platform is acknowledging that that's a form of elitism, and a lot of people don't realize it, and they're like, it's not elitism, we're just trying to promote our profession to grow. And I have a problem with that, because it's something that is inherently toxic, and it kills the profession. It's like a profession of being in a potted plant. I've said this example before, but it's like when you kind of get like the plant wrapping, it like wraps itself and ends up choking itself out. That's what it will do. It will choke itself out, because we're cutting off this pipeline that provides a lot of diversity. And I think we have to learn to see the good and the options. And one day, if we're in a world where people who look like me, people who are disenfranchised, people who are minorities, people who are first generation, or people who are in single parents and working parents can easily access a bachelor's level education, then maybe one day we can phase to having a BSN entry, but that time is not now, and likely it's not going to be coming anytime soon. Because we have a lot of major work to do in nursing before we get there. Just, a thought that I like to highlight to people is that we've been having discussions about BSN versus ADN. The ADN was created because there was a need, and I think it kind of spiraled beyond what the original creators thought. It ended up being a major pathway, and it kind of went further than what people thought. And it was because people needed it. It was needed to help people be able to access nursing. And we've had this conversation since the late 50s, the 60s, about establishing the BSN as the entry. And we're in 2020, and we're about, as far as the number of nurses who have a BSN, I think we're about 57, 58%. So there's a reason why it's taken so long. And even the process of transitioning is not one that is equitable to everyone. And there are barriers to be overcome. Someone who is me, who is not a first generation college graduate, it was a difficult process to navigate transitioning. And throughout that process, once you get to your bachelor's degree, you're not certified, you need to get your certification. You need to get your master's or your doctorate degree. So nursing, and that's not specific to nursing, but it happens frequently in nursing, that it's always, you're not good enough, there's something else. And we're always searching a way to find superiority over one another. DNP versus PhD, MSN versus DNP. And the way we know that this is a concern is that we see articles about it all of the time. And not to say that, and I mean normal articles in magazines and on blogs, but even in the research, it's something that people are thinking about. And so, not to say that we shouldn't study education, not to say we shouldn't study the impact that more education has, but the way we do it and the language we use is critical. And I think it's going to make or break us as we move on in the future.
Thanks, Pat, so much. There's so many juicy things that to kind of pluck from this conversation. And I really appreciate your candor. I too think that we need to work on all of the power imbalances that we have, right? Because I think one of the things that you're getting at there is this sort of the power imbalances and all these things. And we have quite a fruitful group chat going at the same time that y'all are talking. So do know, y'all, we are following along, and we'll do the best that we can to address those questions, while also planning for additional time. I have some ideas for what future conversations could look like. And perhaps as we finish up our conversation here, you could consider whether you'd be interested in joining as a speaker and part of this discussion for another session. So the last question I kind of want to leave our speakers with is the question of how COVID-19 has either revealed or amplified structural inequalities that existed before the pandemic within nursing.
Okay, I can start. COVID-19 really shed a light on the structural inequalities that we see that have existed for hundreds of years and continue to exist in our society. And many of us who already knew, those of us who already work in the community, who work with diverse populations, we already knew these inequities existed. But I think COVID put us in a position where we can't ignore it anymore. It's like, it's everywhere. It's on television. We're seeing these numbers. We're trying to understand. And then now we have the situation, with the violence, that all of that is combining together, but is making us say, we have to do something about it. And there was something I saw in the chat about diversity doesn't help address structural, issues, but I disagree with that. I think that it does. I think when you have everyone that has grown up hearing the same things, they're all together in the room, they may not talk about someone not having a mask. They may not talk about that nursing student who has an associate's degree and is trying to get her bachelor's degree. They may not know those things. So I think diversity puts people in place so that we can talk about these things. And it doesn't start, on that nursing in the bedside situation. We have to go all the way up to the top. We have to go to the directors. We have to go to those who are admitting people into these programs. We have to look at the hospital setting and who's responsible for the standards of care for our patients. But in order for us to do that and look at these other sides of the issues, we have to have diversity. You know, it is something that we can't be afraid of. And it's not always about saying you're right and you're wrong. It's just saying, you know, we have other ways that we need to look at this and address it. We've been doing this for 100 years. Now it's time to do something else. You know, that's all that diversity, that's something that diversity can add, and it's something that we can't be afraid of. And we have to look at it throughout. But COVID-19 really, again, showed us that this is a life or death situation, that we have to look at these structural things that are in place. And a lot of times, again, racism is the root of it. So we have to really look at it and dissect it and dismantle these things. Because I'm telling you, like COVID-19, not only was it about having access to care, it was about having access to quality care. And again, coming into a space and being seen as a human and someone worthy to get that ventilator. If that's the last ventilator, I'm an African-American male, you can't be like, well, you know, well, this guy over here, he has insurance, so let's give it to him. You know, and again, that's only one part of the issue. There's so much more that has been happening that to even talk about, like if you heard these stories, you would be disgusted. I don't have any other way to say that. But I feel like one other thing, and I'll pass on to you, Patrick, because I could go on, is that we always are in this mode. We're in this mode of blaming the person, blaming the victim. And I hate to use the term victim, but I feel like that's what it is. We're saying, like, there was a governor or mayor, someone saying, oh, maybe it's higher among Black people because they don't wash their hands. You know, how dare you? You know, but it's like you're blaming people for things that are in place that they have no control over. And, you know, and it's like, again, we have to be aware of that. It's really a hard truth to look at. And like, I would even, and I think, again, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little emotional too about this, because I think about that patient coming in, everyone's doing their best to make sure they get the right care. And pregnant women have been impacted by COVID-19 as well. The stories are there, but they're not really highlighted in the news. But just to know that people are coming in with complaints and told, oh, you know, you're fine, just go home and rest. And then when they get home, they can't breathe. You know, they come in, they're basically unconscious when they come back, and they were just seen. It's one thing where you're not seen in the healthcare system and you're home with your symptoms, you think you just have a common cold. But when you come in to be evaluated and you're told nothing is wrong with you, you're not believed that you are having chest pains, so you're sent home with Tylenol. So I'm just saying that those are really hard truths that we have to look at. And for me, COVID-19 opened that wide open. And there's no way you can deny that these things don't exist.
I agree. That was, yeah, it's been such a multifaceted revelation that COVID's brought to us. Just clinically, someone who works in the float pool, I'm working anywhere from the ER to the ICU, seeing how different units respond to it. And of course, a lot of hospitals have stopped visitation. Like, no, people are not allowed to have visitors, or if so, it's for very particular circumstances. If you're having surgery, if you're having a baby, you can have one family member that's the only family you can have. That's kind of a policy my hospital has adapted. And the first time it hit me the most that this was that policy, that blanket policy, would impact people differently. I had a Spanish speaking patient in the ER, and I admitted her. And so we're talking with her and we're telling her, oh, you know, well, because of COVID, we have limited visitors. And she didn't really understand. And she was like, okay, well, I know, you know, my other family's going home. They didn't let us come. They only let, you know, my daughter come in with me. And then she looks at me and she says, and I, you know, we explained to her that no one could go up with her to the floor. She was not having surgery. That was what the policy was. And as I'm looking at it, she looks at me, she was like, pero mi familia, but my family. And it's like, how do you look at this woman and tell her, who she always, when she comes somewhere, she takes her daughter with her who speaks English and translates for her. Even though we have translator services, how do you isolate someone like that? How do you tell them, did we think about when we made that policy, how it would impact people who didn't speak English, and how they would, the loneliness they feel might be different than the loneliness of someone else who could at least communicate freely with the staff independently. And that was one of the first times it hit me how unjust and how that equality of not allowing visitors as a standard was equal, but it wasn't necessarily just to everyone because everyone's circles were not the same. And so moving on from that, we've also seen this large transition to online learning. And it kind of circles back to my about elitism in nursing, because historically, online learning has always been viewed as less than. It's been less than adequate. It's not preferred within nursing or in most fields. And if you had an online degree for a long time, even though if the school was accredited, you were thought to have a substandard education. But now we've seen that everybody is online to some extent. And a lot of schools have struggled with that transition, and a lot of educators who have only taught in didactic coursework in person or primarily in person have had to transition, and it's been a struggle. And what I've learned from that is that what we have to remember, because this is something important. People needed online education a long time ago, and we found that of course there are schools who do it worse than others, but that online education, when done correctly, it can be very good. It can be very useful. And what we found is 10 years ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago, when it was emerging, most very established, well-established institutions were kind of hesitant. A lot of them were, not all of them, but a lot were hesitant. And we've seen in the last 10 years, a lot of institutions that in the past would have never thought of considering online education have opened up to it. Harvard, Georgetown, all of these large Ivy League institutions have now jumped on the online bandwagon. But do we kind of see how we got to where we got? Because when we think back to education, a lot of times when a person of color accesses a higher degree, a lot of times it's at a school that doesn't spend as much money per student, and it's at a for-profit school. Not exclusively, but a lot of times that's what happens. And it's because years ago, people were crying, I'm working, I have a family, I just need a program that's flexible. And standard education and universities were not willing to meet that need. So when we talk about things like for-profit schools or predatory schools, we were a part of the blame for that. We weren't willing to meet their need. We weren't willing to be innovative and to branch out into these things. And again, it's not a blanket. And I like to say that if it doesn't apply to you, or my friend Courtney says, if it doesn't apply, let it fly. Whataboutisms, we don't have to go through those, because if it's not your school or you personally, then it doesn't apply to you. But people had a need for that, and we weren't willing to meet it. So we pushed them into these institutions. I saw someone mention like segregation in nursing. So we've pushed especially a lot of people of color, a lot of disenfranchised people, to having to pursue their education at these predatory institutions, because they were the only people willing to, give them alternate schedules, work with them online, do things like that. And so now we're in this situation where it's like, oh, everybody's online. And we realized that people had the ability to do this, but they didn't want to because of their perceived notion of what was better and what was worse. So this has revealed that things could have been a lot more accessible early on in our history as far as providing nursing education and things like that. And so that's something that I really thought about. And now you've had some schools having to learn from some of these major online schools, whether they're for profit or not, about how to conduct learning online. And so I think that's just kind of been an interesting kind of come around, and it kind of gives us indications to the future about not letting our bias kind of prevent us from welcoming people and to making and meeting people's needs. And then the last thought I think about is when we think about the degree of the economic times we live in, a lot of millennials, people my age, are staying at home longer and before they rent or before they buy a house, because they can't afford to live on their own. Life is not manageable on one salary for many people, or in going to college and getting a degree, paying for loans and things like that. So we see those inequities coming up. You have more people living together, especially in minority households. It's a cultural thing sometimes, and sometimes it's just that in order to survive, more people have to live in one household. And so if one person gets COVID, or if one part of the income breaks, then it kind of breaks this whole cycle. or you see people who are afraid to go home. They work in a hospital. They work in they're a nurse, they're a doctor, they work in environmental services, and they have a family. They have 6 family members who live at home with them, and they're nervous about it. They're afraid. They are hesitant to come to work because they have an 80-year-old grandmother that lives with them, and they have a multi-generational household. And so I've seen people have concerns, and they're afraid. They're afraid, and we have to remember this to stop the tendency just to be like, well, figure it out, because it's not everyone has our circumstances. And I think COVID has reminded us that at home life may not be what we thought it was for people, and that oftentimes the inconveniences that come with it and the fear that come with it, it may not even be fear for the person themselves. They're fearful for what they're taking home to their family. And not everyone has the circumstances to be able to go to a second home or rent a hotel for a long amount of time to not expose their family. So those are just some of the things that I've noticed during.
Yeah, and I'm just for someone who, thank God, I defended my dissertation before spring break. If I didn't, I would be working on it right now. And I mean, just to have a 10-year-old that, worried about his educational system, his education, working full time. I was teaching 3 classes, had to transfer them all on time. It's like those pieces you don't think about. There was no way I would have survived as a student.
Yeah. And then even we get into internet access and informational access. And for example, we had a conversation about my Hispanic patients and being able to access the information and on a real-time basis about what's going on with COVID, what's going on with Black Lives Matter or things. They're a lot of times, if they don't have a family member that lives in the home, they may understand, but they're trying to get a good understanding about their alerts about COVID, when they're alerts about things. And we don't realize how sometimes that's a barrier for them. They don't know, they're not sure. And I think that we have to kind of remember, even with internet access, people don't always have access to the internet. You think you can go anywhere and have internet now, but a lot of those places are closed. The library is closed. Starbucks is closed, or they're limited, and they may be opening up now, but that person that was struggling through grad school that you thought was turning in assignments late and just a bad student, he was going to Starbucks to do all of his work because he doesn't have internet at home. And now he didn't have that. And so have we been lenient? And I've just seen some stories on Twitter about professors doing horrendous things and saying horrendous things and not being empathetic. Nursing professors during this time, and it's like, this is an unprecedented time for all of us. You don't know, because not every student is willing or is required to divulge their home circumstances. But right now, if we can offer empathy to our patients regardless, without judgment or with reserving our thoughts, why can't we offer that to each other as nurses?
Yes.
Thank you, guys. I think that there's so much here. One of the things that came up a little bit in the chat, but I also heard bits of this in both of your responses, is the idea that at the same time the pandemic has amplified and really like skywritten these inequities, it's also demonstrated the incredible potential for transformation, right? Nothing that we said was impossible is actually impossible. So that reminds me of Arundhati Roy back in April wrote a piece called "The Pandemic is a Portal." And at the end, she talks about how we can either drag our, kind of yucky stuff with us, or we can choose to leave it behind. And while as a historian, I feel like strongly that we need to know what we're leaving behind and always keep it in mind. But it is like, there is possibility here. There's possibility for transformation, for a more just, equitable future, for abolition of the NCLEX, for all manner of different things. Oh, thanks for sharing that, Chloe. And we're right at, we've got about 4 minutes to go. And so I want to kind of invite you all for another session, another talk, like a talk back, where we can talk more and more openly, kind of with maybe more exchange rather than a sort of structured conversation about how nurses can mobilize to build a more just, inclusive, equitable future for nursing, for our healthcare structures for our communities and for the world. Like, I guess on one level, maybe that sounds like Pollyanna, right? But that's also, I saw, I think, Lisa talking in the chat about imagining harnessing the power of nursing, right? We've got a lot here. And what we got to do is like get it together, right? And mobilize it. So that will be the, yeah, that'll be the question that we can kind of frame our next talkback session with. There's other topics that I see kind of have come up that I think would be worth us thinking, talking, and maybe we can sort this out in the talkback. One of the things is like history. I think it's pretty unanimous seeming that there's a need for us to talk more about our histories, on our specific histories. In nursing, and how, to the point of talking about cultural hegemony, right? How we have this normative whiteness that really permeates the structures and institutions of whiteness, or check that, I'm sorry, of nursing, right? And how we have not only been subject to those, we're also complicit with them in many different ways, and we have been for quite some time, like since the very beginning. So
yeah, but even just for our students too, they need to know their history. You know, I know Florence Nightingale, she's very important. And there's still principles of hers that I follow, but I think for our students and for us, we need to know that there's other players out there that help develop nursing. Those in that very beginning, you know, I think we need to tap into that.
I agree. And I think, you know, getting over the fact that nursing did not start.
Patrick, I don't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Uh-oh, what happened to Patrick's sound?
I don't know. Everyone else.
Oh, no, you're not muted. Are you muted?
How
there you
now?
go. Oh, we still can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
I can hear him okay.
Dr. Canty, can you hear me?
Black women in white.
Oh,
yeah, Patrick, we lost you.
I think we lost you, Lucinda.
Jessica, you too.
We can't hear you.
Hello?
She can't hear us.
Oh no.
Lucinda,
I'll text her.
I just put it in there, but
okay.
I can't. I can't hear you guys.
Okay.
Can I text something?
I'll just put that.
Sorry,
I really hope in the future we get to talk to Dr. Kylie Smith and even Dr. Michelle Drew, because they have informed me a lot on Twitter about things. But even realizing as far back as Ptolemy back in Egypt, that there was a curriculum for nursing and for midwifery back as far as that, and then with the Moors and prior Nightingale. So it's just again being centric and nursing. I said this in a thing just to make it brief because I know we have a little time, but nursing. Modern nursing being Florence Nightingale, our son, and the whole nursing universe revolves around what she did and but what people are realizing now is that there's a whole universe out there of other luminaries in nursing, and that people came before and that people have come after her that are equally lighting the way. So.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and you'll be hearing from us again so we can kind of get a talk back on the books. And we will, if you have any interest in participating in a panel discussion, please do reach out. You can either contact the Nursology Theory Collective email address or me or Chloe, certainly. And we will be looking forward to talking with you more. Thanks so much for making time. I know it's like the closeout of the week, so.
Thank you, everybody. And just a last announcement before we finish off, as I know we're all ending up here. The last thing I'll say is a call to action is there was a lot of conversation in the chat about what do you do. And so my call to action, our call to action would be is to go out and talk to your colleagues, your students, your administrators, your managers. Go have these conversations with them and continue this conversation, and then come back to this webinar and share your experiences, and we will go forth and suggest more things that we can do collaboratively. So thank you all so much. You'll be receiving an email from us hopefully soon, and have a lovely weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Canty, and thank you, Pat and Jeff.
Yeah, thank you
Thank you,
guys.
It was
guys.
great.
You're
Yeah.
everybody. Just appreciate it.
It was great. Anytime.
Take care, everybody.
All right, you too.
Thank you.
Yeah, Chris, we will share the link. I think we're planning to share the video link on from the Nursology website, so I'll make sure that I tag you on Twitter. I guess we probably should have shared our Twitter handles and things like that too. That wasn't a next time.
That's part of us giving ourselves grace, right? So yeah, we'll put it on YouTube and then we can share it around. So, but I'm going to end the meeting, and hopefully it won't take forever to upload, but have a wonderful night, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.